Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the premiere of our second series of Africa Talks and to the 11th episode of this format. My IJP colleague Eka and I, we welcome you for this edition. Africa Talk is designed as a digital platform for exchange of African and European topics, exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. We want to learn, we want to engage and discuss about what are Africa Talks. Yes, we have to talk. I'm Marco Wormer, I'm member of the board of the International Journalist Program's IJP, and I would like to introduce to you Eka, my colleague.
Okay, my name is Eka Neumann. I'm the coordinator of the African program of the International Journalism Program, and I'm super excited about today's edition.
Our topic for today is the super election year 2021. What are the learnings in Germany, Europe and Africa? Are the issues and challenges comparable? In September this year, Germany has voted and is now the formation of a new government is taking place. The members of parliament will vote for a new chancellor to follow Angela Merkel. People in 13 African countries are also called to the polls in 2021. What role did the COVID-19 pandemic play in the election campaigns on both continents? What similarities and profound differences are there in the electoral systems? What do the election campaigns look like and what new formats have been established? And last but not least, what role did media coverage play in the election campaigns? And this we want to discuss with the following guests.
Okay, so our guests of today are Baidessou Soukolgue, the head of election and political processes department of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, and Moki Makura, and she's the executive director of Africa No Filter.
Dr. Wigan Salazar is political strategist and public affairs expert and the CEO of MSL Germany. And last but not least, I think he's still making it into our call, but we are very sure that he will also join us, Joe Chialo. He is executive vice president by Universal Music in Central Europe and also a politician who was involved and who started an election campaign for the German parliament this year. And he will let us know about his experiences and what he has learned. Before we start with our panelists' input, I would like to introduce our graphic recorder, Wiebke Koch, to all of you. Wiebke will take graphical notes and sum up our conversation. Here we have her in picture. Wiebke, you are also ready for taking graphical notes, right?
Yes, as ready as I can be.
Okay. And now we would like to introduce our guests to you.
Okay, and I would make the start. Baidessou is the head of the Elections and Political Processes Department of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. And he teaches at the École nationale d'administration et de magistrature in Chad. He's a lawyer by training and a graduate of the École nationale d'administration en France. And he's a very knowledgeable person and has been involved in a lot of elections, and has a very broad experience on elections. So we are very happy to hear from you what is happening in terms of elections in Africa these days.
Hi, everybody. Hello from Tanzania.
Hi, Baidessou. Eka, you follow and introduce also Moki, and I will do the last ones then.
Oh, we do the introductions as we, okay. So great, Joe, that you have arrived. That's perfect. We have you here. So we heard you have been struggling making it to be here on Africans' roads, challenges everywhere. Great to have you. So let me introduce the next speaker on our distinguished panel. Actually, we are very delighted to have Moki Makura. She is the executive director of Africa No Filter. which is a donor collaborative focused on shifting the African narrative. And I'm very sure she's going to tell us what shifting the African narrative would mean. Prior to that position, she's been serving as a Deputy Director for Communications in Africa at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she was responsible for building and managing the foundation's reputation on the continent. And prior to her engagement at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, she's been the communications director to the Tony Elumelu Foundation in Nigeria. And she has been a well-known TV presenter, producer, author of several books, publisher, and a very successful entrepreneur. And she holds honors degrees in politics, economics, and law from the Buckingham University in the UK, and is very much interested in creating positive imageries of Africa. And one of her activities was the website which she created, Africa.com. Very happy to have you on this panel.
Yes, and I will follow with our next guest coming from Germany, Berlin, Dr. Wigan Salazar. He is a political strategist and public affairs expert. He heads up MSL's operations in Germany and is part of the country leadership team of the Publicis Group. His focus as advisor is on public affairs, public diplomacy, reputation management, and crisis communication. He knows the electoral system in Germany very well and has monitored the election campaigns over the last years, not only from the professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective as a CDU party member. Before joining the Publicis network in 2001, Wigan Salazar worked in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He worked also in the German Bundestag and for an internet startup. He studied history, economic history, American literature, and Indonesian in Bonn and London. And he holds a PhD in economic history from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Welcome to our show, Wigan. And last but not least, we have Joe Chialo in our Africa Talks edition of today. He's born in 1970 to a family of Tanzanian diplomats in Bonn, the former capital of Germany. He took his Abitur near Cologne, and after a manual apprenticeship as a CNC milling cutter, he studied history, politics, and economics in Erlangen for a few semesters. Then he gives up his studies in favor of a recording contract with Sony Music and the singing career with Blue Manor Hayes. And his subsequent career in the creative and cultural industry took him to Cologne, Amsterdam, Munich, and finally in 2002 from Hamburg to Berlin with the world's largest music company, Universal Music. In 2020, he was additionally appointed Executive Vice President at Universal Music Central Europe and Africa, and he has been since then responsible for the identification and acquisition of artists from the African cultural region, as well as their marketing in Germany and Europe. In 2016, he joined the party, the CDU, the Conservative Party in Germany, and he has been active in the local association in Berlin. And as a member of this association, he was responsible for the promotion of pop culture, and he was committed to promote young up-and-coming talents. And as I said already, he has been conducted a campaign in this year to become a member of parliament, which unfortunately didn't work out, but he will let us know about his experiences and his learnings here. He's married and the father of a doctor. Welcome to the show, dear Joe. Very happy that you could make it to be on Africa Talks edition 11. And now we would like to start, Eka.
Okay. We would like to first hear from Baidessou. What are the current trends? What is the current situation about elections on the African continent. We have heard that there's been 13 elections, bigger elections been scheduled for this year. Could you tell us what is the situation around elections on the continent at present?
Uh, 1990 years, with a real enthusiasm of the population, has been replaced by a kind of skepticism across the continent, a skepticism of the population in many countries. And now elections are more and more seen or considered as a waste of time and resources, because the outcomes are already known before even going to the vote. And there is no challenge in so many countries, because we know those having the power will manage to win the election. But despite this situation, we should highlight some examples, like the one of Zambia, of Cabo Verde, of Sao Tome and Principe. And those examples shows that there is still a hope for democratic enhancing in Africa. But mostly we are in a kind of backward of democracy, with those military coups we had recently in Chad, in Mali, in Guinea-Conakry, in Sudan, and even in some other country where there is no military coups. The quality of the election are not the same. We cannot, because there have been some elections somewhere, attest and testify that the process has been fair or not. That is the overall of the situation across the continent.
So thank you. Thank you, Baidessou. And we would move on in our first round by giving Wigan the floor and giving him the opportunity to let us know about his observations on the German election campaign, which took place just a couple of weeks ago, and where we faced change in government, and what were the main learnings and the main points you made during that campaign, Wigan?
Yes, it was a very interesting campaign this year, because we actually had the pole position among the biggest parties changed actually 2 times, and 3 different parties were on top during the past half year before the election. So the CDU, where Angela Merkel, who is a member of, was on top at the beginning. Then the Greens were on top, and at the end the Social Democrat Party was, and the Social Democrat candidate will most likely be the next chancellor. It was an interesting campaign in the sense that it was the first time a long-serving chancellor like Angela Merkel stopped on her own and said, "Okay, I'm leaving politics. I haven't lost a single election on a national level, won all of them, and I'm going to retirement," which is which opened the field for a very wild, and not in the sense that, but for a campaign which was where one didn't, which was a bit of a roller coaster over time. But I think even though it was a roller coaster, the most important thing is here. One of the most important insight is here: the German electorate. And this may be a big difference to other countries, and especially Africa, I guess, is wanted above all that things don't change. So actually her vice chancellor, who is from another party, is turned out as the winner. And I think if we look at the topics in Germany, it was a very defensive kind of atmosphere we had. So foreign policy didn't play a role at all in the debates. So there's at least the journalists didn't show much interest in what's happening outside the world, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Asia, what's happening in the US. So it was very insular, and even the big topic of climate change, which is you would say Germans are most interested in that. It was fairly big, but the Green Party, which is kind of the champion of combating climate change, didn't come out on top at the end of the day. So it was a bit, in a way, it was, although it was a roller coaster, it was also a sedated campaign in a way, because everybody said, okay, we're not really talking about issues. So we're really talking about small things. We're talking about gaffes on the campaign trail, somebody laughing at the wrong moment, or somebody having some problems with their CV, which perhaps would, so the Green candidate had a CV where she was honest, but she did not completely, it was a bit exaggerated, let's put it this way. And there was a natural catastrophe in Germany with a flood, and in one moment the CDU candidate laughed at the wrong moment. So we're talking about this, we weren't talking about issues at all. So it was a very in that way, a very strange campaign. And if we look at COVID, for instance, COVID was completely kept out of the campaign. It was rightly so, I guess, because it kind of threw the different parties and divides. It was there. So I think what we have to learn in Germany, in a way, is let's talk about issues again. How can we debate among each other? Because even COVID would have been worth a debate, but people were, I guess, afraid to kind of fan some voters to the far right or the far left who would have a say on this. So it's really very, very much a personality campaign game at the moment in Germany. If we look at we have state levels too. So we have the federal level with at the moment still Angela Merkel, and state levels, and it's always the incumbent who wins. But this is a European phenomenon. In the French regional elections, the incumbents always win. So people in Europe at the moment like to vote for the person they know, and they like to have a feeling, okay, well, things are changing around the world. I don't know if I like this. Let's just take the guy or the woman we know. And so it was a bit puzzling for me, this whole election campaign, and perhaps we still have to learn a lot. And I guess in Germany we have learned to be a bit insular over time. And I think that this was the success story of Angela Merkel in many ways, because everybody had the feeling, okay, she's taking care of us, everything's going to be fine. And I must say, she herself was somebody who cares a lot about global topics and who really cares a lot about these things, and also has an active role outside, but at the same time tries to pad it off in when it comes to how much impact it has on the German population.
Thank you, Wigan. Coming to Moki, you speak about narratives and the role of media in covering Africa. And what observations can you share with us, having heard that what has taken place in the German way? Are there similarities? Are there things you can compare to your experiences?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for that. There's a couple of things that you just said that came up for me. The incumbent always wins. Angela Merkel has been voted in a number of times. It's very much a personality game. These are traits that are always prevalent in African elections, but this is not necessarily how African elections are covered by the media. So I run an organization that works on narrative change on the continent. So we spend a lot of time looking at how Africa is covered. And one of the consistent and persistent stories that come up time and time again when Africa is covered in the media is around our elections. Now, you've heard that there are 13 elections. There were 13 elections in Africa this year. Next year, they're going to be 12. They're going to be some big ones. I think Kenya's going to be coming up for election, Angola. This year, the big election, I think, was Uganda and was in Zambia. And I'm going to come and talk about that. But one of the things we did earlier on when I started at Africa No Filter was we looked at the kind of frames that media cover when it comes to Africa. And there's 5 frames that consistently come up. One is poverty, corruption, disease, poor leadership, and conflict. And all of those, probably apart from disease, come up in the way African elections are covered. So just before I came on, we have a data scientist in-house, and I asked him to look at global media coverage of Africa between 2017 and 2021. And we just chose 4 random topics, one of which was elections. The other was music, climate, and sports. And elections have traditionally been the most dominant theme up until mid-29. And just recently started going down. I think that has a lot to do with COVID, but also climate. The climate discussion has taken over the sort of conversations in media around Africa. But let me talk a little bit about a piece of research we commissioned, which was on how African media covers Africa. And it's interesting to see that of the all the stories we analyzed, and we looked at over 300 articles across media outlets in Africa, and looking at how they covered Africa. And the most persistent story was politics. And at that time, when we did the research, there were 5 elections going on the continent, and it was Ivory Coast, Guinea, Egypt, Seychelles. So a lot of the conversation and in media, again, was politics. And this seems to be pretty consistent. Now, I want to just help you understand the kind of narrative we get around elections, because a lot of it is linked to conflict and violence and unrest and just negative words. I'm going to come up with some of the words that we see consistently, but I'm going to read you a headline, and that sort of typifies, what we saw in the elections in Tanzania. Here's a headline: Tanzania's president, John Magufuli, has won re-election with a landslide victory in a poll that the opposition has described as fraudulent. Notice the word fraudulent. The elections in Guinea, headline from an international outlet again. Guinea elections, Alpha Condé wins 3rd term amidst violent protests. The word violent. Ivory Coast, headlines: Ivory Coast President Ouattara has won a controversial 3rd term in office in an election boycotted by the opposition. And I could go on. There's always certain words that we get associated with that are just always kind of negative. It's almost as if an election in Africa cannot exist unless framed in a particular way. And I think media have consistently just, I think, gotten lazy, because there's a lot more we can say. I mean, one of the most widely covered elections in this year, in 2022, was Uganda. And then there was the Zambia. And I wrote an opinion piece about the Zambian elections. And it was interesting because despite all the evidence, a lot of the headlines predicted complete chaos. And I'll give you an example. The Economist: Zambians head to the polls, but hopes of a free election are slim. Another one: Zambia approaches elections amid repression. And here's one that we seem to get: elections to test Zambia standing as a stable democracy. Almost as if we just don't really know how to do democracy very well, or we don't know how to do elections very well. And I do have a point to say about that. But in the end, what happened with these elections, despite all of these headlines, was that it led to a handover power that was free from violence. So the coverage about African elections is really problematic. Words like violence, fraud, corruption, unfair, tensions, conflict, chaos, and social media shutdowns always come up. And actually, just so you know, in a period of 2016 to 2019, there were 55 countries that shut their internet down. In the top 10 countries, not one of them was in, well, only one of them was in Africa. Top 3 were India, Pakistan, and Yemen. Sorry, excuse me. So I think there's an assumption that election coverage in Africa is somehow still a test for democracy. And actually, for me, I think that it proves that democracy and the institutions that we're meant to uphold are actually working, and they're being tested. And when we sort of look at media coverage, the thing that we kind of most often see is missing is that there's no context in the storytelling. There are these bold headlines, sometimes unsubstantiated by current fact, but maybe from previous reality they're basing their headlines on. But the context that I think is often missing in stories, that Africa is a very youthful continent, and we throw that figure out. But let me give you an example. 77% of the population in Uganda is under 25. Now think about that. And I think in Germany, your population between 15 to 25 is something like 12%. So we are a very young population, and I use that because I think it has implications on the electoral process and the elections. The fact that young people going out to vote, I think, is critical, because throughout the world, we've seen that young people don't vote. In Africa, they are going, because the elections in Zambia, they had a 70% turnout for elections. It was pretty high. And all of these elections are hotly contested. The ones that get covered a lot in the media, very hotly contested, because there's two, people. And, in Zambia, for example, over the 7 years, the 7 elections they've had, they've always consistently had handovers of power, peaceful handovers throughout all of those elections. So the incumbent has not necessarily won every time. Even though there's, in Uganda, it's different. I mean, Museveni has been in, this is 6th term, and he seems to still be going strong. And in fact, there's a young man on my team who's in his 30s and has never known another president. Interesting. But, just to go back to the point that I think is also missing, in that democracy is still relatively young. I mean, Zambia, for example, has had 7 general elections. And I looked at the numbers for Germany. I think you have data going back to 1949. You've had up to 20. You've had 20 different elections. So you had 20 opportunities to practice at elections, fix what's going right or wrong. And we're just not there yet on the continent. And the last thing I will say with media coverage is that there's a decline in interest in politics. And we're definitely seeing that on the continent. A lot to do with the fact that this population is young. They're bored and tired politics, because our newspapers here are dominated by politics. So, they're beginning to find alternative sources of news. So a lot of news goes around on social media, and this takes us to the fake news and the, and the misinformation. But the story of elections in Africa, and I'm going to end with this, is that it's actually more complex and far more interesting than the media often gives us credit for. Because there is this single story that it's all doom and gloom, and it's chaos, and it's violence, and it's conflict. And I feel that we do need a new framing of hope and change, because every time people go to the ballot box to put their vote in, they're hoping for something different. And the point is that these elections in Africa are happening. They're so hotly contested because people want change. We've got a young population who are restless. So I see all of this as good, whereas the narrative, the framing of it often tends to be negative. So I'm going to hand back to you now to say that I still feel that media coverage needs a lot of work on the way they cover African elections.
Hey, thank you so much, Moki. Thank you very much. Joe, looking at that, what Moki just said, and maybe coming back to 2 points which he raised, decline of interest of people in politics. Did you face that? Did you see that? What is your opinion about that in your campaign? And then things which go wrong in African elections are portrayed. Are there things also going wrong in Germany, especially Berlin? And maybe you could, would you have something to say on that as well?
Yes, sorry, my background is very loud, I guess. It's because I had to find a shelter so I could jump in. I hope it's fine. First of all, I'd like to join what Moki Makura just said. We need a new framing of hope, especially when it comes down to Africa. It's full of cliches and it needs a new story. But going back to my election in Germany, I had the feeling that after 16 years of Angela Merkel, the people were like really interested in what's going to come next. And I felt that my party kind of fell back to the old behavior, like trusting that Angela Merkel is somehow going to do it, or the party is somehow going to solve it, or the people are somehow going to trust the brand of CDU. And what we did not have was content. We had no content that was relevant to people's lives, especially simple people who were so much concerned about their social security. So like the SPD said, you know, the Mindestlohn, Wigan maybe can translate that, it's going to be 12 euro, like the
minimum wage.
The minimum wage, it's going to be like 12 euros. So CDU had nothing that the people could lean to. Everything was, you know, very much in an intellectual bubble that nobody really got to know or really understood. And that made our campaign really, really difficult. And unfortunately, though I personally really liked him very much, the candidate, Armin Laschet, was not people's candidate. The people missed Angela Merkel stepping out of the office, and they had no one else who was strong enough to make them believe that CDU is gonna, you know, be run confidently as it was the last 16 years.
Thank you, Joe, for this first insight you have given us. Sorry, did I?
No, it's okay. It's okay. No. The only thing that I just wanted to kind of like add a little bit was I also very much missed the big topics that Viga mentioned. We didn't talk about Europe. I mean, we're talking about digitalization. We're talking about climate. We were talking about globalization. Everything that has to do with the nations and people connecting throughout the world. And that played zero role. And that has a lot to do with the population within Germany. They're all about euros on average, and the topics are handpicked for them so that they get the votes. But they're not discussing the real topics that are so vital for the future of the country and Europe.
Thank you.
I'm curious to ask, Marco, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just ask Joe, you know, I mean, they talk a lot about, you know, nationalism, you know, and it seems like a global trend that people are not really that concerned with what happens outside. They're more concerned about what happens in their backyard. So, I mean, is that not a reflection of what you saw in your election?
Yes, it's so crazy. The closer the world gets, the more the people tend to take care about what's happening in their backyard. It's absolutely so. And me being the candidate for an area, Spanda, which is very conservative, was some sort of a tricky kind of experiment for the CDU. I mean, I lost because I think also the CDU as the party in general lost a lot of votes. But for a lot of people, I think they want the security from how it used to be so that they can cope with what's going to come. And I feel that this is also the biggest danger that we can have looking forward. There is no trust in the in youth as they should have. And if you look where especially my party, and when you look to what kind of parties the youth were hanging into, was FDP and the Greens. And I think that we have to reprogram ourselves as CDU to find ways on how to communicate, which topics to put in front, and to create a new vision for the future. I think we're still too much busy on some sort of like pleasing the voters so that we get elected again. And we're not brave enough. And I think we need to be much more brave.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting, actually, Marco, if you don't mind me just saying, you know, I sit in South Africa, and, you know, the ANC have been the ruling party. They were the Freedom Party. And people don't understand that no matter how much they mess up, we went through 9 wasted years, what they call wasted years of Jacob Zuma, where there was blatant corruption. You know, we're still reeling from that. But ask your average South African who they will vote for. They will tell you ANC, because it's very difficult to disconnect that sort of sense of this is the party that brought us out of, you know, apartheid. No matter what they do, even though we don't, we will still cast our vote. And there's people who try to set up parties. They don't work. You know, every time you hear a new politician, I'm like, you know what? No one's going to vote for you, because people go back to what they know. It's like a beaten wife, you know. Somebody says, look, there's another man that'll love you. No, but I know this man here. And it's a bad analogy, but it's almost like that. It is to a certain extent, but yeah.
Ms. Makura, it's the same thing here in Tanzania. We have the CCM, which is the longest ruling party in Africa, founded by Julius Nyerere. And it's exactly the same situation here. And nothing's going to change, I guess, in the next few years. The only thing that I really very much appreciate is that we have a female president, Mama Samia. So it's something completely new. And yeah, this I think is a good sign.
I don't want to interrupt this really interesting conversation, but what I would like to say and what I would like to give you the information also is, like, we have a couple of alumni, a couple of people from our alumni network, a couple of journalists here also in the call, and I will. We haven't welcomed you like formally because we haven't. I forgot it at the beginning, but I would really like you to enrich our talk with your questions or comments. Yeah, so if you have comments, please let us know, and then we will bring you into our discussion. Till then, I would hand over the question again to Wigan. When I hear what you said, yeah, that we need a new framing of hope. Why is it so difficult for journalists, especially, to frame these positive things? Why is it always much more interesting? It seems, for instance, to be to look behind the scenes and to look for the bad things, the things who are not working, etc. Why is it so difficult to get this framing of hope, of start, of restart, of reset, maybe into the discussion? Because this has been like, I think this is the same thing in this is the same thing on both sides or on both continents.
I think it's a tough question to ask a PR consultant to say, how can we get things in a positive frame? Because I don't see it as my job to kind of give recommendations to journalists, because it's their job to work as they are, and I take it as it is. But I must say, in Germany, we have a very critical journalism, which I think is good. But it's perhaps in the DNA in Germany that people don't really like to have something very visionary and optimistic and these things. And so people are looking for the mistakes and the mishaps, and that's fine. That's their job. So I think it's their job in a democracy. So it's very hard, say, from that perspective to really get the issues in. But what I must say is it's also, in a way, also up to the players who are there to really to always address these issues. If you I think if you get into a good dialogue and say, hey guys, if we look at say the examples we had from Africa, why do you always talk about why do you frame us this way and not in another way? And I think it's a long discussion and dialogue you have to start. In my daily work, working with journalists, it's often the case that I have to challenge them and say, okay, this might work well for you to get clicks and everything, but it's only part of the truth. How can we work together on finding it out? But there's always a fine line. So it's always as I said, Marco, it's hard to ask a PR consultant to give the right recommendations what journalists should do. But perhaps this might have some kind of at least a kernel of truth or something where a solution can be made of.
Yeah, thank you, Wigan. I got the message. Taking or handing over the question again to Baidessou. We heard, and this is maybe not similar, but this is interesting from my point of view. We heard much more young people are electing in African countries. We also had a high percentage of young people voting voting this year for the German government. And what was interesting here in Germany is that the youth is separated into two fields. The one field is voting for climate change, for green economy, etc. So they are very, very much open for green topics. And the other 50% voted for the liberals, for conservative liberal party, not for the conservative party from Joe, but for the liberal party. Is there a comparable way of how the young electors vote in African countries, Baidessou? You are still on mute. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think in Africa, young people need change, but they are not always used to mobilize themselves for this change. And it is here the occasion to highlight what happened in the Zambia. They have been a lot to mobilize themselves and then to get the change they wanted to have, because the former president has been seen as a Chinese president, someone who is not taking care of youth. And then they mobilize and give the change to the elect president to come into power. But the problem in Africa, young people are not voting based on the programmatic side of the politics. They vote just according to the ethnic or on a clinic basis. That is the most important thing they are used to do here. And it is also because talking about the role that journalists can play in creating new waves, creating hopes. We don't have properly a media freedom or a free media who can mobilize young people on thematic issues like climate, liberalism, or socialism. That is the main problem in Africa. We have young people, but they are not used to vote. They don't trust political men. They lost interest in politics, but they want change. And that is the main challenge we are facing when working with CSO in some specific country. If you want change, you need to mobilize yourself and go to look for this change. But they are not willing till now. Hopefully, we had these cases in the Zambia. We had it even also lastly in Cabo Verde, where young people were a lot about out to vote, but it is not the case in all the continent, but in all the countries.
Baidessou. I have a question, Moki, because I see there's different angles and different perspectives. So how do you think these analyses of Baidessou and your perspective can be put together into a way forward, and how to report and how to portray and how to tell stories about the African reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things. First is that it's very difficult to talk about Africa as a single thing, because there will always be an exception to the rule. There are 54 countries. So when you say Africans, there's always a danger that it's not. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is I don't think we're that far apart. I think we've got research that shows that young people, they're not interested in politics the way old people see politics. They don't express themselves by voting. They get onto social media. There's other things that happen. So because they're not following maybe the traditional routes in certain cases, you kind of think that, well, they're not interested in politics because they're not voting. Because a lot of the people who are voting and are running for elections are not young. That's why Uganda was really remarkable. Bobi Wine was in his 30s. And it was a hotly contested election there. And he was a musician, so he had a lot of the youth vote behind him. But the thing is, Museveni still won. But what I do think that we can do to change the way, the way I would talk about the way elections are covered, because at the same time, people still have to get their information from somewhere, and it does boil down a lot of the time to media. And I think, Wigan, you said that, oh, it's not up to you to change the framing, but we actually want to change the framing, because a lot of the way journalists write about the continent, it's just out of just habit. It's habit. How many times have you seen, a headline saying Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, Haiti, the world's poorest country? Those are all platitudes, we say them. And I was on a panel with the lady, the editor of New Humanitarian, and she said something really interesting. They're trying to do what they call decolonize their newsroom. And it goes back to context. And this is what she said, that when you write Haiti, the world's poorest country, contextualize it. Why is it poor? Tell the country what happened. What did the colonizers do to Haiti? Why is it poor? Give you context. And that's what I'm calling for with the coverage of elections. There needs to be context. So you don't just have a headline about Zambia this, or, it's going to, or Uganda this. Give us a context of what's happening in that country. So yes, I do want journalists, when they come to do a story, go in and look at the facts. Look at the facts. Don't feed this habit that you have of, always writing about Africa in the negative. And we do know, journalists chase, they say if it leads, it leads. I mean, if the world is your newsroom, you're going to pick up the worst story, right? And Africa is just one of a number of countries. So, when we looked at that data where I said there were 7 elections over the period of time we covered our research, the two elections that got covered were the ones where there was political conflict, where there was violence. You know, those were the stories that the world wants. So I think just to hand back to you, I think it's not so much about changing the election process. I'm more concerned about the narrative, the stories we tell around elections, because they influence behavior. Narrative influence behavior. So if we want to change behavior, we need to change the narrative.
And Joe, for your election campaign, did you made the same observation that, like, when you bring things into context, that people then listen to you and that they understand why you stand for this or that point? Is that the secret of success, to contextualize?
Yes, I think that was, in my case, at least the case, because the people, especially in Germany, most of them, they're living in their little bubble, and they do not really get the full concept of things, because the media is very much driven to hunt the clicks. So you just write or you produce shows just to get this effect, and I think it's so important for a lot of people out there to understand the full context, and that was what I was trying in my social media activities or my talks when I was out there with the people on the streets, just to contextualize things. But as I said before, the program that we had as a CDU was not handmade so that I could succeed, or that we could, it was, I think we are in a process of redoing a lot of things to succeed. So I'm quite confident that with the new head of party, with a new program, with a lot of things that haven't been brought to the end within the party, a lot of groups were working on a new program. If we finish that, then I think we're going to be able to even contextualize even deeper and more, looking at the elections coming ahead next year. Yeah. Hello?
Looking at the looking as we were trying with this talk to look at where there's similarities and probably and Joe, I think you touched on one issue which I found very interesting: social media and campaigning with social media. What do you think was the importance of, or what is your outcome of your campaign online? Does it reach other people than usual? Can you engage in different sort of dialogue? How was your feeling about that?
My impression was that in terms of campaigning, even a big party like CDU was still caught in a stone age. We had candidates who had to upload their profile because they had none on Facebook. I'm talking about Facebook. So if you don't even know how to handle Facebook, how are you going to communicate on Instagram, or how can you differentiate between Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and all those? I'm not talking about Twitch or anything like that. So this was kind of a challenge, and I think it's also a question how you communicate. Instagram is much more lovely surroundings, so you can boost your personality much more. And when you enter Twitter, it's like a war zone. So you had to, as a candidate, find the right mixture on how to present yourself, because it cannot be like a wild dog, like, you know, fighting everyone on Twitter and not mixing it up with other, you know, positive vibes, which I did on Instagram. So it was like I copied everything I did on Instagram basically on Facebook, and then I focused on Twitter here and there. But what I've realized is that we in Germany are not as far. I mean, you know, the generation that's voting is the elderly generation, and they're not really very much ahead. That I realized. So I think this is also something where we need to catch up and where we need to cope, and where we need to find that. But it also differs. You know, I think the SPD was much better than the CDU in the internet, and that had to do with Lars Klingbeil, who is like a digital expert. He did a great campaigning. We were like, we had a very weak campaigning. We couldn't attack, and we couldn't protect. We were just bystanders. And this has been going on since the very first attack from a guy called Rezo, who's an internet influential guy who is attacking the CDU whenever he feels like. And whenever he attacks the CDU, we go like, oh, another video from Rezo. And there's no counter attack. I mean, it's a shame. And this has to do that our party in its understanding is still wants to appeal more for the elderly and not for the young ones. And this has to change, I guess, because the world is changing.
Can I ask a question quickly? Again to Joe, I'm just curious, you know, because you talk a lot about social media. What about traditional media? Were the traditional media outlets, were they covering you?
Oh, yes.
Were they giving you good, you know, was it good publicity, or
yes,
you didn't really look at that?
Yes, I had really, I had coverage from ZDF, I had coverage from RTL, Bild Zeitung, FAZ, Süddeutsche. I had covered a lot of really serious media that were covering me as well. So I personally cannot complain. And I think I found the right mixture between the so-called serious media and the new media. I think it was all right and it was happening. But it's the question who you're targeting. And if you, the question that people asked me most was, why is someone like you a member of CDU? That was the most asked question. Like every day on the street.
They meant what? What did they mean
meant
by
me,
that?
you know, a guy who's coming, you know, I'm by nature a music manager.
Right.
And I hang around with artists. The way I speak, the way I work, it's completely different than my colleagues from the CDU operate. So they're very, I'm not a political kind of guy. And there's no one like me, I guess, in the whole CDU. And they're like, what are you doing there? Why aren't you not with the Greens? Because there would be like a lot of them. Or even SPD, they would say, yeah, he fits there. CDU is so conservative that they ask me, what are you doing there? But I'm there for good reasons, because I really like their values. And I think that their values, they have a meaning, especially in such uncertain times as we live in. But they need to be polished, and they need to find a new language, and they need to find and then they will be hip again. I'm very much sure so. Sorry, I got 5%. So when I knock out, I'll try to come in with my mobile phone. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Maybe one last round, because we are also almost at the end of this premiere of our second series of our Africa Talks edition. But I would like to make a quick last round for everyone. By also driving an issue which we haven't discussed yet, and this is COVID-19. We here in Germany, we are in front of the maybe fourth wave, as we say, the fourth wave of infections. Although more than almost 80% are vaccinated in Germany, we are still thinking and not knowing what is going to happen. I would really like to know from everyone here in this round, in our round here, how much did COVID-19 affect elections, or even the people's mind when it comes to a vote? Yeah, like did it really affect people in African countries? I would like to start with Baidessou, and then coming over for Moki, and then the German or the European perspective with Joe and with Wigan. Baidessou, may you start?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, of course, the pandemic was a challenge for African election, because most of the country who organized election in 2020 and 2021 were not able to allow everyone to vote. In Zambia, in last August, the government has been accused of using the pandemic regulation to silence opposition, because it wasn't allowed to gather people for campaign, but the government continued going across the country, but the opposition couldn't. In SA, for the local election, the 1st of November, the Electoral Commission wanted to postpone the election, and the court said no, the election must take place. And fortunately, it takes place. And we also, another example in Niger in 2020, where people couldn't get registered on the voter list just because of the restriction due to the pandemic. And now we lead some countries move to online campaign. But the problem also with the online campaign is the challenge of internet connection and the digitalization of electoral operation. The connection rate is quite low across the continent, and the connection cost is also higher, still higher for most of the population. And we have also the shortcoming of the control of online campaign activities and the risk of the operation. You know, when it is online, most of the country, even if they have a media regulation body, they don't have the possibility to follow what is going on online. And with the explosion of citizen journalism, the risk for violence was evident in some countries. That is the challenge rise and due to the COVID pandemic across the continent.
Moki?
Yeah, I like I said, I live in South Africa, so we didn't have an election during this period, like a big general election. But what I will say, that something that I feel that we found is that COVID-19 was not so much a health crisis for the continent, but more of an economic crisis. The impact of COVID was not health. It's not necessarily about vaccines. It's about the fact that the unemployment rates, which are already high on the continent, got higher. It was just a tough time. And I think what we actually started seeing, and a lot more people started talking about mental health issues, which is something that Africans don't typically talk about. COVID was catastrophic for a lot of African countries. People were just sitting at home doing nothing. Africans are out and about doing whatever we do, but a lot of that is changing now. You can see, I mean, like, I'm Nigerian as well. When I speak to my family there, it's like COVID, occasionally there might be a mask, but COVID is really just something that other people talk about. And because they've just had to just carry on living, because what, you stay at home, you social distance means you don't eat that day. So, I think the point that I want to just make, that COVID was more about, if there was an election in the country in this last year, I think it would have driven people more to vote, because people want change. People are hungry. So I think what's at risk is far higher for Africans during this period of time than it ever has been, because it really is tough times. So I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Moki. We just have one. We have time restrictions. Wigan has unfortunately to leave. Maybe Wigan, one last sentence from your side before you are leaving.
Yes, of course. Yes, COVID played a role, but nobody talked about it. Because it was really people couldn't really organize as they could. You couldn't have big rallies, and at the end of the day, a political campaign has a lot to do with personal contact and kind of really working the crowds and going from. Of course, you could still do a bit. I think you could learn a lot, because there are many things we can bring into new campaigns in the future, virtual formats, and you can really get things done. But I think the way traditional political parties work, it made it very difficult for them to switch. And people, you really noticed, okay, this. So there were two things. One thing, political organization didn't really. The political organizations weren't really up to it, and the other thing was people didn't want to talk about the topic because it was so divisive, and said, okay, we half of our voters want tougher regulation, and the other half wants more lax regulation. Let's better not talk about it. So COVID played a role, but it was kind of the big void and the big unknown.
Thank you, Wigan, and all the best for your next presentation.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from our alumni, from one of our alumni. I would like really to bring into it, maybe also as to fit it into the last round. And Lamia is asking, we have talked about the change of narratives. What needs to be done to add to these changes, you think? I think we have tackled it in some ways, but maybe we could, like in our final comments now, we could just point to that, like what needs to be done to add these changes, to add these changes of narratives. And I would hand over to Joe.
I think we need to challenge the media partners, and when we are dealing with them, we need to. Me personally, I'm working on the as a music manager, as I said, and I'm trying to create stories that kind of show another side of Africa constantly. I'm trying to tell them that Africa is a creative superpower. I'm trying to create other narratives so that they feel that there is more life in this continent than just repeating the cliches, so that they get more and more curious. I think also we need new heroes. Not the ones who are coming out of Africa and playing in Chelsea and then return back to Africa. We need ones in Africa who are staying here and who are heroes over here as well, and who love to be here, like singers or whatever. And that's why I wanna show to the world what kind of great creative resource Africa has. This is, I think, my part of it, and maybe you have that in the economical side and filming and so on.
Thank you, Joe. And maybe Moki, your last point on this, your last 5 cents.
I don't really have the last 5 cents on what needs to change. I mean, for me, it's really all about, you know, the perspective, the narrative that kind of needs to change. The African elections are more about hope and change, and we should frame them that way, because I think that's just more useful than the current way they're framed.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Eka.
Yes, and thank you to everybody. I would like to see what Wieke has been grasping in the meantime while we've been very busy talking. Wieke, what have you got? Have you got something to show us?
I'll switch to what I've got. Let's see if it works. Oh, that's blank.
Okay.
It worked before.
That's like technology at times. Let's try a second time. In the meantime, yes.
There we go.
Okay. Can you just highlight 2-3 issues which you grasped and which you found interesting?
Yes, of course. I think what we all heard a lot about is that there is still a lot of stereotypical frames around the narratives when it comes to the storytelling about elections in African countries. They very much focus on what doesn't work, conflict, unrest, etc., rather than that democracy actually does exist and that it might be tested, but it actually persists, and every time it's a new opportunity to build on it. Whereas in Germany, we have different challenges, maybe not so much around unrest and conflict, but about a roller coaster of very defensive elections that are very insular and not really featuring debate about the important topics like climate change or even foreign affairs in any matter, or COVID, even though all these things influence our direction. And we've also heard how especially the CDU is kind of still very old-fashioned and doesn't include the youth and how to reach them, which is something that maybe is differently done in African countries. How about that for a start?
Issue, I would say, and thank you very much, Wieke. I think what I take away from this talk is really look into the diverse stories. I'm taking that away, and I take away as a learning as well in doing this process, looking and hearing the African voices and diverse African voices to look into topics like be it elections or be it other topics. And I think that's something I really take away and take along with me for the next editions, which are to come. So next week, we would like to focus on climate change. And it's been a great pleasure to have you all on this panel. It's been wonderful to discuss these topics and working towards and contributing towards changing the narrative for a very diverse set of countries, which is framed within the African continent. And yes, thank you so much for being there. And
thank you very much for your attendance, and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.